Welcome, everyone. Read One Communications presents the Scholars Chair. At Focus is an interfaith discussion of a book entitled People of the Book Prophet Muhammad's Encounters with Christians, written by Dr. Craig Considine. And here is our moderator.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Tameeka Washington. I am the founder and president of the Interfaith Coalition of Bowie, and we have a wonderful program for you this evening. So I will introduce the speakers. We have Reverend Holliday. She is the pastor of Village Baptist Church here in Bowie, Maryland. She's a graduate of the McAfee School of Theology, where she studied Christian social ethics. She's married to Scott, a local school teacher, and they have a son, Franklin. Khalil Shadeed is president of Faith Matters Islamic Center in Fort Washington, Maryland. He has worked with interfaith groups for more than 20 years as president and co-founder of the Islamic Society of Southern Prince George's County. He's an award-winning television producer of a program called The Scholars Chair, which is broadcast on cable channels 42 and 79 from CTV. He's also the president of Read One Communications, a multimedia graphic design company based in Fort Washington. And finally, our guest of honor, Dr. Craig Considine, is an award-winning professor and the best-selling author of The Humanity of Muhammad, A Christian View, and People of the Book, Prophet Muhammad's Encounters with Christians. He's a recognized authority in interfaith dialogue and has written several books and multiple articles for the field of Christian-Muslim relations and Islamic studies. Dr. Considine's opinions appear regularly in leading news and media outlets around the world. He also has experience in filmmaking, having directed the critically acclaimed documentary film Journey into America. He's a practicing Roman Catholic of Irish, Italian, Scottish, and English descent, and a native of Needham, Massachusetts. Dr. Considine also holds a PhD in sociology from Trinity College Dublin, the University of Dublin, a Master of Science in International Relations from Royal Holloway at the University of London, and a BA in International Relations from American University in Washington, D.C. Welcome. I will turn it over now to Mr. Shadeed for his opening comments.
The reason why I am involved with interfaith dialogue is in fact the Quran and the tradition of the Prophet Muhammad inspires me to do so. Christians and Jews, according to our book and our tradition, are not our enemies, and they're not the godless. They're not people. They're not pagans. They're not people who we are to fight or be against in any way. And I would just simply offer a Quranic verse because I think I joined shoulder to shoulder with Craig in establishing bridges between these two faiths, as well as the Jewish community, mainly because the Quran speaks of it that way. Here are two verses I'll share with you, and I'll get out the way and leave the floor for more insightful people. And that is that the Quran says, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim, it says that it is he who sent down to thee, speaking about the Prophet Muhammad, step by step, in truth, the book, referring to the Quran, confirming what went before it, and he sent down the law of Moses and the gospel of Jesus before this as a guide to mankind, and that he sent down the criterion of judgment between right and wrong. This further supports the notion that that in the eyes of God, that all these religions that are mentioned are legitimate in the eyes of God. The next verse I will share with you goes to the prophets, and the verse reads, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim, we believe in Allah and the revelation given to us, and to Abraham, to Ishmael, to Isaac, Jacob, and the tribes, and that given to Moses and Jesus, and that given to all the prophets from their Lord. We make no difference between one and another of them. These verses are, again, supporting the cohesiveness of the oneness of God and the oneness of humanity. And that's what my 20 years in interfaith dialogue has proven to me, that when I meet Jews and Christians who are committed to their faith, I generally find a very strong kinship. And I will leave my fellow believers to that I'm sharing this platform with to further elaborate on that. All the best to everyone.
Thank you, Mr. Shadeed. All right, Reverend Emily Holladay, over to you for your opening remarks.
Thank you. So I was really excited when Khalil reached out and asked if our church, Village Baptist, would want to help be a part of this conversation. Tonight, I feel like I am a learner alongside everybody else. And so I'm excited about hearing not only about the book, but all the different things that Dr. Considine found out as he was researching, and the ways that this conversation can help to expand and inform our community here in Bowie and Prince George's County. And so I'm really grateful to Khalil for organizing this, and Tameeka, to you as well, for constantly keeping us in interfaith dialogue and helping to move this community in a way where we can work together and build upon the love and justice that are foundational to our beliefs. As I was thinking about this night and preparing, I was reading an advanced copy of a memoir written by Daniel Vestal, who was the coordinator of the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship for 16 years, which is the Baptist body that our church most relates to. And he was writing about a time he said in 2002, when a former Southern Baptist Convention president made some very critical, controversial comments about Islam and about Muhammad in particular. And of course, 2002 is a time and we know this is still continuing today, but when the Muslim community was under intense scrutiny because of 9/11. And so Daniel Vestal, who was the coordinator of CBF, reached out to, he said, 10 different Muslim organizations in the US to express, he says, expressing my dismay at his remarks and making clear that he did not speak for all Baptists. And in response, he received a letter from the executive director of the Islamic Society of North America, which is the largest Muslim organization in the country. And the director thanked him for his letter and asked him to speak at a convention that year in Chicago at the Interfaith Unity Banquet. And he shared some of the words that he spoke that day. And so I thought that they really matched the spirit of what I wanted to be here for and wanted our church to be a part of this for. So I wanted to share some of the words that he said today, or said almost 20 years ago. And he says, Hans Kuhn, professor of ecumenical theology, wrote the following words in his classic work, Christianity, Essence, History, Future. No peace among the nations without peace among the religions. No peace among the religions without dialogue between the religions. No dialogue between the religions without investigation of the foundation of the religions. I have come to this convention to learn and listen. Most Christians have little knowledge of Islam, its history, its theology, or its practice. We are willfully ignorant of the faith that shapes the lives of more than 1 billion people on this planet. My desire today is to be a learner. I've also come to nurture friendship. Can Muslims and Christians be friends? I mean, can they really be friends where there is mutual trust, open and transparent communication, and shared values? I believe they can, but it will take intentionality, patience, effort, and perhaps a sense of humor. Finally, I've come to this convention to let you know that there are many Christians who passionately yearn for justice, reconciliation, and peace within our human family. I'm from the faith tradition called Baptist, and I'm aware that in recent days there have been Baptist voices that have spoken words that are demeaning of Islam with a rhetoric of violence. Please know that there are other Baptist Christians, as well as Christians from other traditions, whose words and deeds are different than those often reported in the media. It is our understanding, community, and common cause. As we all know, there are profound differences between us, but I also believe that there are profound similarities. And one of them has to do with the human desire and divine mandate for justice and peace. Could we be at a point where citizens of this great nation, as people of faith, as members of a global village, we might work together for peace? Could we be at a point where we all, as children of God, might pray together for peace? Might it be possible that instead of seeing ourselves in a struggle with each other, we see ourselves in a common struggle for the welfare and well-being of every person in the world? I believe that we are at such a point, and it is possible. To that end, I offer you my hand, my heart, and my hope.
Good.
So those are his words, but the words that I wanted to share today as well.
Thank you, Reverend Holliday, and thank you, Khalil, for those wonderful words and for setting the foundation for our keynote speaker this evening. Dr. Considine, the floor is yours.
Tameeka, thank you so much for your ability to weave us all in to this event, which I surely hope is enlightening to our viewers. Khalil, thank you for not only organizing this event, but also for your 2-decade-long service on behalf of bridge building. And Reverend Emily, you nearly made me cry reading that verse and or that passage from this speech. And I want to add too that Hans Kung, who you mentioned at the beginning here, was a Catholic like myself. And Hans Kung was a pioneer in many ways for bridging the gap between Christians and Muslims. Hans Kung is like myself. He recently passed, may God rest his soul. But he also identified Prophet Muhammad as a prophet. And to do so as a Catholic comes with a lot of repercussions. Hans Kung was basically exiled from the Vatican, exiled from the church for his views. So what we're dealing with here, this intersection between Islam and Christianity, and more specifically, the topic today, which is a view of Prophet Muhammad really through the lens of Christianity, it cannot be taken lightly. People take this very seriously. And what I hope to do here is to really provide a sociological backdrop to Prophet Muhammad's interactions with Christians. I'm a sociologist by training. I inevitably deal with theology and religion, but my aim as a scholar, and more importantly, as a public intellectual, is to present history, theology, sociology in ways that will resonate with people through stories, through concepts that even children can resonate with. So I have 6 concepts that I'm going to go through in the next 10 minutes or so. The first one is what I refer to as cross-cultural navigation. Cross-cultural navigation. This is essentially a person who is able to weave in and out of various communities that have cultures. So this could be, ethno-cultural communities, racial, relatively racially homogenous communities, and it could be religious communities. And then there's intersections among all those. Prophet Muhammad was living, born in 570, in a time that was really a struggle between competing empires. We had the Byzantine Empire in the Middle East, in the Holy Land, and then we also had to the east, the Sasanian or Persian Empire, which was Zoroastrian. And we know because Muhammad was, as a young man, a very young man, even a teenager, was part of various merchant communities, right? Merchant trading caravans. He was traveling with relatives and later his wife Khadija, traveling to all these different cities in the region. And these were not homogenous cities. These were cities that were multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-religious, and so on and so forth. So Muhammad at a very early age had, I think, an appreciation for diversity. He was interacting with Christians. And the story that I focus on early in the book was that which unfolded around 582, when Muhammad was a young man, he came across a person called Bahira the monk. And Bahira was part of a Christian sect, and I unpacked this in the book, which sect was he specifically, but all in the fold of the Byzantine Empire. And it was Bahira, according to the Islamic sources, that saw something special in Muhammad, essentially forecasting his future as a prophet, saying that this young person has a gift. It's a gift from God. He has been chosen. And I think this is really important because it's important for us as human beings to see greatness even outside of our identity categories. We should be able to objectively evaluate people, not based on what religion they say they follow, but their character and conduct. So Muhammad was growing up in this environment, traveling to Busra. Busra in Syria is where he met Bahira, but he was traveling to Jerusalem, to Petra, all of these different cities. This was a person who I think was familiar with Christian communities. So this idea of cross-cultural navigation, I hope, serves as an inspiration for Christians and Muslims today. Get outside your comfort zone. Enter into a space of prayer that you're not used to. Eat different types of food with people that you usually don't interact with. Muhammad appreciated this diversity. The second concept I want to talk about is mysticism. And we know that Christianity has a long history of mysticism. And by this, I mean, a kind of outward, existential, transcendental experience with religion. And when Muhammad received his first revelations in the year 610 in the cave at Mount Hira, this is when the angel Gabriel, who also visited Mary and told Mary that she was going to give a miraculous birth to Jesus, Angel Gabriel is the person that initiates the revelations to Muhammad, which are later documented in the Quran. Muhammad was someone who appreciated the importance of isolation, thinking by yourself, being alone, contemplating the mysteries of the world. When he receives these revelations, as you can imagine, Angel Gabriel is there shaking him and alerting him, this is about to happen. You've essentially been chosen. I don't know if anyone has had a type of spiritual moment like this, but it can freak you out a little bit. So what does Muhammad do? He goes back to his home in Mecca. The first person he consults is Khadija, his wife. The second person he consults is Khadija's uncle, Waraka ibn Nafal, who was a Christian. And we know this through Islamic sources and Islamic history. And Waraka ibn Nafal said something similar to Bahira the monk, that Muhammad, you are destined to do something quite extraordinary. And Waraka said, again, according to certain Islamic sources, that Muhammad was chosen to bring a law to his people, just as Moses brought the law to the Jewish people. So here we have a Christian affirming the prophethood of Muhammad at one of the most vulnerable times in Muhammad's life. It was a woman who first said, yes, what you're experiencing is real, it's true. The second person is a Christian. I find that to be powerful. So we have cross-cultural navigation, mysticism. Third concept is allyship. This is a concept that is quite popular, especially among young Americans. The idea of standing alongside one another when things are difficult, being an ally. I think everyone is probably familiar with what it means to be an ally. So now we move forward to 615, when Muhammad's community, these believers who identify themselves as monotheists or as Muslims, they were experiencing extreme persecution in Mecca, largely from Muhammad's own tribe, the Quraysh. And Muhammad tells a group of his followers, of the believers, to leave their homes, leave everything behind, cross the Red Sea, basically become refugees, And across the Red Sea, you will go to Abyssinia. And in Abyssinia is a just king. This is what Muhammad told the believers. There is a just king whose name is Ibn Abjar, King Ibn Abjar. And in short, what happened between this interaction with the Muslims and the Christians, King Ibn Abjar refused to hand over the Christians back to the Quraysh, the enemies of the Muslims, because the Quraysh were also in King Ibn Abjar's court. Ibn Abjar refused to hand them over because he had spent time with them. He had listened to them. He had heard verses of the Quran. He had heard Muslims speak of the prestige that the Quran has for Jesus and Mary. And that's extraordinary. So here is a leader of an empire, the Abyssinian Empire, defending the Muslims at one of their most vulnerable states. The next concept that I want to look at is, actually, I'm going to talk about two in combination here, and that is diplomacy and hospitality. You know, we often think of Muhammad only as a prophet, right? And obviously that is his highest kind of level, his highest status, but he was also a diplomat. And later in his life, right before he died, he was sharing his message with the other rulers and leaders around the Arabian Peninsula, some of which were Christian. In modern day southern Saudi Arabia and northern day Yemen, you have the city of Najran. And this is an ancient city that had previously witnessed in the years before, in the decades and centuries before Muhammad's prophethood, extreme religious strife, Jews massacring Christians, and just bad relations. Muhammad invites the Christians of Najran to visit Medina on an official diplomatic endeavor. And the historical sources, Ibn Ishaq in particular, mentions that the Christians of Najran and the Muslims of Medina spent 3 days together. That in itself is significant. It didn't end after 2 hours. It didn't end after 4 hours. They spent 3 days together. So obviously things went well. Towards the end of this diplomatic endeavor, the historical sources tell us that the Christians of Najran and the Muslims of Medina engaged in a dialogue, a civil dialogue on Christology, a very sensitive subject, the nature of Jesus. Who was Jesus? The Christians of Najran, according to my research, they were Trinitarians. They believed in the Trinity. They adopted the Council of Nicaea Creed in 325. So Muhammad and his people and the Christians come together. They talk about these things and they agree to disagree, which is fine. Agree to disagree, but you do so with cordiality and you do so with civility. The hospitality angle, so that's Muhammad the diplomat. The hospitality angle comes in at the end of this experience with the Christians of Najran. The Christians of Najran were seeking time to pray while they were in Muhammad's mosque, Masjid al-Nabawi in Medina, which still is there. And the Christians of Najran are saying, you know, this is our time now. We need to go pray. We're going to go outside into the streets of Medina. And Muhammad said, here you are. I mean, I'm paraphrasing kind of, I'm picturing what Muhammad would say. You're already in a house of God. Here you are. Use our space. And I think this is perhaps one of the most important things that Muhammad did in his life, because he's showing that being hospitable is an act of faith. It's an act of faith, and being hospitable doesn't, you know, in this context, allowing Christians to pray in a mosque doesn't jeopardize your faith. It doesn't jeopardize your faith because God has given us so much. God is hospitable in nature, and it's our duty to kind of mirror God's blessings and his mercy and his compassion and his love. And then finally, I'll end real quick on one of the last things that Muhammad did in his life. When he returned to Mecca peacefully with the believers, Muhammad went to the Kaaba, and the Kaaba had been essentially a polytheistic shrine in which multiple religious communities and groups would use this space to honor their deity. And there were a lot of symbols, like physical symbols, objects that were all around the Kaaba. And Muhammad saved, according to, again, historical sources, some sources say it was a fresco, others say it was an icon of Jesus and Mary, of Mary holding the baby Jesus. And Muhammad said, get rid of all these other symbols, but keep this one. Keep this one. And again, I find that to really be symbolic of his entire approach towards the Christians of his time. The book also gets into the more contentious issues. It gets into some conflict and some struggle. And I'm happy to speak about that. Perhaps it'll come up in the Q&A. So that's a brief sociological snapshot of a book that has a lot of information in it. So I'm looking forward to hearing some feedback and taking some questions. So thank you for listening.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Considine. That was a great rundown of the book, talking about cross-cultural navigation, mysticism, allyship, diplomacy, and hospitality, and just looking at honoring the importance of other faith communities. What a powerful picture of the Prophet Muhammad you've painted for us. So we will open it up for Q&A. If you have a question, you can raise your hand and unmute yourself. You can put it in the chat. I'll take the personal privilege of the first question while folks gather their thoughts. So our first question is, how does the Quran regard the Torah and the Bible?
As authentic revelations. It's quite clear on that. Jews and Christians are considered al-Kitab, people of the book, which is a special status. Essentially, this is the way I refer to it to students. Islam is a continuation of previous legitimate revelation. It's not really coming necessarily with anything new. It's coming in many ways to make something more perfect, more whole, more divine. We also know that the Quran has an entire chapter dedicated to Mary. And I mentioned this in the book, the Quran actually honors Mary more than the Bible does, more than the Gospel or the New Testament. There's more written about Mary, I believe, in the Quran. And of course, we know that the Quran recognizes Jesus as, the Spirit and the Word from God. I mean, those are really powerful descriptions that I wish more Christians actually knew about. The Spirit and the Word from God, or of God, depends on linguistical issues. And really, if you dive even deeper, much of the Sharia, which in popular discourse is referred to Islamic law, but it's more, I think, of a way of life, of how to live a proper life connected to God. Much of that is taken from the Old Testament. All right, so I think the Sharia, if I could refer to it more broadly as such, has deeper connections with the Old Testament. And then the New Testament comes in, and that's where like Jesus and Mary come in. So, and I'm not even getting into how the Quran recognizes Abraham, Adam, David, Solomon, John the Baptist. I mean, so many prophets throughout time. So I like to think of it really as we're really one big family. Even if you want to take it a step further, we are sects of monotheism. Karen Armstrong, one of my favorite authors, refers to herself as a freelance monotheist. And I really like that term. I don't know how Karen practices. I've never met Karen, but these are healthy terms, I think. And I think they lead to constructive relationships and more bridge building.
Thank you so much for that answer, which prompted a thought that I had earlier this year. We had a discussion about women in the faith communities and what challenges they face. We did this during Women's History Month. And one of our speakers talked about Mary in the Quran. So I immediately went and picked one up because I was like, as you know, I was raised a Christian, but I was like, I have to see this. So I've been working my way through the Quran as well. So it is a very powerful testimony to who Mary is.
And Tameeka, it's really the same story.
Yeah.
If you go to the gospel and then the Quran, it's really the same story. It's a reflection. I mean, slight differences, but really only in words. That's where the angel Gabriel, like in the book, Tameeka, angel Gabriel is really a continuing theme throughout the entirety of the book. Angel Gabriel visited Prophet Muhammad, according to the sources, multiple times. And in researching this book, I had no idea that Angel Gabriel was that involved in Muhammad's life. So in addition to Abraham and Jesus and Mary, we also have Angel Gabriel. He's a link to all of our traditions.
I love it. So there's a question in the chat that says, does the Quran mention fighting?
It does. And one of the things I respect about the Quran is that the Quran makes self-defense and this idea of potentially engaging in fighting as something that is legitimate in the eyes of God. I had a really powerful conversation once in Detroit at one of Imam W.D. Muhammad's mosques with a imam there. And we were talking about some of these verses that refer to killing Jews and all this stuff. And the imam said that what happens with some of these verses that talk about fighting is people take them out of context. So there is a part of the Quran that mentions this, but then it says right after talking about Jews, but if they desist, let them be, right? So there's a very defensive nature in terms of engaging in conflict and warfare in the Quran. It's not saying completely lay down, which is actually an interesting potential comparison to Christianity. I mean, Jesus is talking about turning the other cheek. Like, how do you a lot of Christians interpret that differently. But I think in general, the Quran advocates only for defensive war, and that there are very strict stipulations on what justifies a just war. There has to be severe wrongdoing. The Quran, let me be explicit here. When you read the Quran and you get to some of these verses about Jews, which if you read literally and don't understand the historical backdrop, they could be very scary. But if you understand when these verses were revealed, you will understand the meaning of the verse. Muhammad was working with Jews. This is in Medina. In 622, Muhammad enters the constitution of Medina with Jews. Jews are given freedom of religion, freedom of property, freedom of conscience. Muhammad is giving them these things as the ruler of Medina. That's quite powerful in itself. But what ends up happening, the Constitution of Medina agreement breaks apart. And some, according to the Islamic sources, some of the Jewish tribes were essentially backstabbing Muhammad. So the revelation is coming to address that specific point. It's not referring to Jews eternally being, the enemies of Muslims. Khalil mentioned earlier that Juan Cole has been on the Scholars Chair program before. Juan Cole, in his latest book, Muhammad, the Prophet of Peace, does an incredible job of basically explaining the social, political situation in which these verses from the Quran were revealed. And that's very, very, very important. Understanding the social context. When was this verse revealed? Why was it revealed? So that's important.
Yeah, no, I would agree. Context is so key when we're telling the stories that are in our religious books, for sure. So there's a couple of comments and questions. I'll start with Rashida Bilal Sanders. Christians and Muslims lived in peace under Islamic laws in the past too. It's great what you brought up. Chapter 19 in the Quran is beautiful. Meaning Mary, she and Jesus are mentioned by name more than Muhammad, right? So going to the point that you made. And then Kareem Shabazz wrote, I have authored a book capturing profound similarities in Jesus and Muhammad. It's titled Jesus and Muhammad, Two Rays of the Same Light. Do you think this discussion is supportive to your book and platform?
Absolutely. And I have read Kareem's book. I believe that Kareem and I are kindred spirits in our own ways, but also Jesus and Muhammad were kindred spirits. And the one way that I really like to connect Jesus and Muhammad is actually through the prism of Judaism. And there's a famous saying that was presented to me when I first started this journey back in 2003. When I was a student at American University in Washington, D.C., God put me in the presence of a brilliant man named Akbar Ahmed, who is the Ibn Khaldun Chair of Islamic Studies at American University. I'm sitting in his class, having all of these nefarious ideas about Muslims and Islam. And the first thing he starts talking about is the emphasis that Prophet Muhammad placed on knowledge, on ilm, and not just knowledge through scholarship and learning, but knowledge through human interaction. That blew my mind. The second thing he mentioned was the Hebrew phrase tikkun ulam, which means to heal a fractured world. And this is a great saying, one of the true kind of powerful and inspiring testaments of the Old Testament. Jesus and Muhammad, in my opinion, came to work on tikkun olam, to heal that fractured world, to bring both Jesus and Muhammad were concerned about the periphery of society, the people that have been completely left behind. We know in Muhammad's life, he is gravely concerned for orphans, for young girls that were being treated as objects, for the poor, for the dispossessed. Who does that remind you of? If you're Christian and you were raised in a proper Christian environment, it was the same thing. So Kareem, his book is excellent because it really breaks down the parallels, the similarities. And even, and I mentioned this in the book, even Muhammad himself referred to Jesus essentially as a kindred spirit. They just had different mothers. That's how he referred to him. I mean, I remember growing up, we had a funny saying, I have a brother from another mother. And it's quite similar to how Muhammad kind of framed his relationship with Jesus.
Thank you so much for that, for those thoughts. So Khalil Shadeed has another question. Does the Quran ask of Christians to follow their holy book?
Does the Quran ask Christians to follow their holy book? I would say yes. One of the verses that sticks out to me is that there's no compulsion in religion. And I think that allows for a certain degree of freedom. I think the Quran understands and recognizes that there are certain truths found in other religious perspectives and traditions. And the Quran is providing space and the freedom for these people to follow their will, follow their conscience. And that's probably not a popular opinion, but that's my perspective.
Thank you for sharing your thoughts. So Ryan Carey writes, I think that during the century before Muhammad, the Christian church was defining a strict doctrine and identifying heretics. I've wondered whether Islam grew out of some of the Christians who were exiled from the community of Christian believers. What are your thoughts on that, Doctor?
Well, I deal with that question in detail in the book. And early on in the book, I talk about the history of Christianity. And one of the books that was very influential in my writing and researching was Mustafa Akyol's The Islamic Jesus. And this is a book written by a Muslim about Jesus. So kind of the opposite of the stance that I've taken. But Mustafa talks about the very early struggles, rivalries, debates happening within Christianity. And he refers to the Church of James, which was centered in Jerusalem, being one that had a doctrine of following the halakha, Jewish law, and that's what they were most concerned about. And Jesus was the Messiah, and he was a prophet, but he was not the Son of God. And then we have Paul. Paul comes in. Paul has a completely different experience. Paul helps to develop this idea of the Trinity. The Jerusalem church goes east into the Arabian Peninsula, and the, let's call it Paul's church, goes west into Europe. All of these different debates were happening for 325 years until the Council of Nicaea in 325. And I talk about this in detail in the book. In short, the Council of Nicaea finally put the stamp on the church's official Christological position, which is that Jesus was the Son of God, and that the Holy Spirit and God formed really the essence of what God is in the Christian doctrine, which is the Trinity. And if you didn't buy that, you were a heretic. And what happens to heretics? They're exiled, they're pushed out. So I deal with this in the book. I refer to groups, early Christian sects that had different ideas that were kind of outside the box of the mainstream church. We had the Ebionites, the Elkosites, the Essenes, all of these different groups that have kind of been forgotten. And researching this early Christian history has really impacted, how I think about my own faith. I do not like heretical accusations. I don't like calling anyone a heretic. I don't think it's helpful. And this hopefully is not taken the wrong way, but the groups that lost out at the Council of Nicaea and later councils, which I also talk about in the book, those groups have a very similar approach to God and to Jesus as Muhammad did. And I'm not saying, and again, I know how this could be misconstrued. People are saying, I think Islam is a sect of Christianity. That's not what I'm saying. But there are parallels between the groups that lost out at the Council of Nicaea and the revelations that Muhammad received. And I think that's hard to dispute. But again, people might question my intentions in saying I'm trying to water down Islam. That's not what I'm trying to do. I'm just looking at the historical records.
Thank you for that. Reverend Emily has a comment. She says, before we started the call, you mentioned that you felt like you learned more about Christianity through writing this book. What surprised you about Christianity, particularly Christian relationships with Muhammad, in your research?
Reverend Emily, thank you for that. The first part of that question really has to do with what I just said. I was never taught about the Council of Nicaea, about the Council of Constantinople, the Council of Ephesus, the Council of Chalcedon. I mean, all of these things shaped modern day Christianity. And the way I was presented Christianity, it's like, this is just what it is. This is how it's been. But it hasn't. It hasn't always been that. There were debates. People were coming together trying to grapple with really complicated ideas about the divine, who Jesus was. So researching for this book made me appreciate or made me more concerned about the importance of freedom of thought and freedom of conscience. And it made me especially weary of powerful forces in society and around the world trying to dictate who is what based on their belief. And this is where I'm explaining that heresy is not, it's not helpful, it's not healthy, and it's not constructive. And I think we need to move away from it. The second point, what struck me more about studying Muhammad's relations with Christians was less to do with the actual events that we know of, because many of those I was familiar with prior to writing the book. But Reverend Emily, like some things that I think stuck out, when I mentioned the story of Bahira, right? One of the things with Bahira the monk and other Christians that Muhammad had met, there was always like a environmental component to these stories. So like Muhammad was sitting under a tree, he was being protected by the shade, or a cloud came and a cloud was hovering over Muhammad and protecting him from the desert sun. And I thought to myself, that's really interesting. What does the Old Testament say about the importance of trees or clouds? And then I'm starting to think to myself, the more I read, little tidbits like that, I think are really interesting. And there's a huge section in the notes portion of People of the Book, the book that I wrote, in the first chapter, which talks about the legacy of clouds in the Christian and Jewish tradition. So looking at Muhammad's encounters with Christians provided me with an opportunity to dive deeper into the theology and to try to make sense of some of these kind of supernatural occurrences in Muhammad's life.
Thank you for that, Doctor. Khalil Shadeed asks, how important is it for there to be dialogue between Christians and Muslims, and to what end?
It is one of the most pressing concerns for all of humanity today. Obviously, there are things that transcend any religious grouping or difference: the care for our planet, the threat of nuclear annihilation, of war, of conflict. All of these things, I think, are higher up on the list. But if we look at demographics and politics, Christians and Muslims, depending on what source you get the populations from, make up almost half of the world's population. Just Christians and Muslims, half the world. So half of the world could potentially be at odds with one another, which could trigger all of these other things that I mentioned, environmental catastrophes and warfare. So I like to pitch this as a common sense thing. These are the two largest religions in the world. And if you look at projections, these two religious populations are only going to get bigger. So it's actually common sense for us to engage in this dialogue because we are a significant chunk of the human population. The second point has to do with politics. The next book that I'm in the process of writing, if you look at the countries around the world where it's most difficult to be a Christian, they tend to be Muslim majority countries. If you look at the places in the world that tend to be most difficult for Muslims, it's secular Western Christian countries. So there's a serious problem with religious minorities being able to live a dignified and honored life in which their human rights, freedom of religion, freedom of worship, freedom of conscience, freedom of speech, all of these things are in jeopardy. So multiple factors in terms of the urgency to promote Christian-Muslim dialogue and bridge building. It's, in my opinion, to borrow the term from Adam Smith, it's common sense.
I love it. Thank you for that. I think we have time for one more question, and that'll be from Rashida Bilal Sanders. People of the book, can you elaborate on the term's meaning? That says a lot to me. As a Muslim, I love finding similarities. I'm Muslim, my grandma was Christian, and her character was impeccable. I think I got that spirit from her. Your grandma sounds amazing.
That's
Dr.
beautiful.
Considine?
That's beautiful. Yeah, so al-Kitab, people of the book. And in the very first page where I actually start writing, so not like there's a glossary at the beginning of the book, but the very first paragraph, I talk about the symbolism of book in the singular sense. It's not books, people of the book. What does that tell us? That there really is a singular, not necessarily a book, but there's a singular truth that we all share. And of course, there's different ways. The Islamic tradition is essentially saying, we've purified it, we've corrected a few things, but essentially it's the same. If it was books, it would be less inclusive, wouldn't it? It would be less inclusive, but it's people of the book. We all share the essence of that book. And this goes back to the point I made earlier of us really being sects of monotheism. We are sects of monotheism. And I think this is one way of potentially furthering the bridge building process. We are monotheists at heart, even though some Muslims would say that someone like me who believes in the Trinity, I'm a pagan, I'm a polytheist. I've never met a Catholic that believes in three gods. We're monotheists. So Al-Kitab is it's a poignant reminder of what Islam came to do. It came to further previous revelation that was gifted from God. But we're all coming from God. That's the singular source. That's the one uniting factor. And we would be silly to forget that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Considine. Thank you for your book. Thank you for your words, your presentation. Thank you for answering questions and the robust discussion we had from everyone who participated. We'll have our closing remarks. We'll start with Reverend Emily Holladay.
All right. Well, thank you so much. This was very engaging and enlightening, and I hope that everyone will check out the book. I think, it obviously, now Dr. Considine said he has written 7 books, so probably a backlog that would be hard to catch up on quickly, but I would love for us to continue this dialogue as a community, to continue learning more about one another. Throughout the conversation, you started talking about bridge building and you ended talking about bridge building. And I think about that, when you consider a bridge does not generally go nowhere. It connects 2 communities. And they're 2 communities that want to be connected. We have bridges because somebody wanted to get from point A to point B and wanted to have an easier way to get there. My church knows that I am terrified of bridges, particularly the Chesapeake Bay Bridge. And I actually went to the other side of Maryland recently, and I drove through Delaware to get there to avoid the bridge. And on the way back, I did go across the bridge because, there's 3 lanes and I could go in the middle. It felt a little safer. But, it's a metaphor for, it took me 5 hours to get where I was going, to go through Delaware, and cost me a whole lot of money in tolls that it wouldn't have cost me to go just straight across the bridge, and took me quite a bit less time to go that way. And I think about that in terms of our communities, that when we build bridges, it helps us connect to each other in ways that takes away barriers and allows us to see those commonalities, to see the clouds and the trees and the Marys and the Gabriels and all the things that connect us, as opposed to the things that keep us further apart from each other. And so, Khalil has been doing this work in Prince George's County for decades now. And I hope, to be a part of that going forward, and that our communities can continue to dialogue and to, potentially find ways to build bridges that are shorter than 4.3 miles, so that it's a little even easier and safer and less scary to feel connected and to feel a sense of community with one another.
Thank you, Reverend Emily.
Hey, Tameeka, do you mind can I respond to that real quick?
Yeah.
So, Reverend Emily, I think this is really important because you touched on metaphor and symbolism. And I actually want to bring something up that actually someone in our audience here, my uncle Safi Kaskas, who is a role model of mine, who has been doing this type of work for a lot longer than I have, and who's also endorsed a previous book of mine. Uncle Safi mentioned one time that I picked up on social media, essentially, and I'm paraphrasing, you know, people walk on bridges.
Yes.
Bridges go through a lot of, you know, pressure, turmoil. People get walked on, you know what I mean?
Yes.
And Reverend Emily, I would say, my advice, if I could give it that, is to support the bridge builders, because it's not easy work, and it's daunting, it's exhausting, it's deflating, it's defeating, but it's a lot easier to be that bridge when you know that there are additional people there to support you and to keep you up.
My goodness, this conversation feels so much like worship. Thank you all for sharing. Mr. Kaskas, did you have something you wanted to add? I saw you unmute.
Yes, in fact,
I just unmuted myself just to be ready. I am very happy that Craig remembered that bridge builders sometime get walked over, all over, especially from those that they trying to bring together. And every day I see this is happening to him. And in my own mind, this is the price we have to pay if we want to bring people together. And it's like a cross that we have to bear. And we are doing this, and I see him doing this patiently. He's not even complaining that much about it. And I'm very proud of him. Thank you, Craig.
Thank you, Uncle Safi.
Awesome, I love it.
You were going to introduce Dr. Safi Kaskas, and I was going to do the same. His work is outstanding. If you have a chance to read his book, The Quran and Contemporary Analysis, and it is a relationship between Jewish Christian scriptures, biblical scriptures, and the Quran. It is a book worth having if you're doing interfaith dialogue and you need to go back and forth. There is an expression from the Islamic tradition that says, go forth all together for the sake of good, and God will bring you together. And I think that's some wise counsel. You stole my thunder, Craig. I was going to introduce
I'm sorry,
Dr. Kaskas at the end to give us a summation, which is perfect. But I just want to ask him just before we leave, what do you think about this evening, and should we do more of them?
I love it. As a matter of fact, what we need to do, in my opinion, is to continuously bring people together who believe in building bridges. And someone said, I think, I'm not sure who said this, but they don't know where the bridge should start, where it should end. Mm-hmm. Actually, we have a lot of common ground. All you have to do is pick up your common ground that you're sure of and put the foundation there, and let the other, who you accept as he is, as she is, put the foundation for their side of the bridge on the common ground they know they have, and the bridge will start taking shape. So we don't have a problem as Christians and Muslims to build bridges if we want to live together in peace on this planet. After all is said and done, Jesus came to show us how to build peace together. And the Quran, I wouldn't compare Prophet Jesus to Prophet Muhammad. I will compare Jesus, because he's the word of God, to the Quran, who is the word of God. And they both together teach us how to bring peace, how to build peace in this world. So there is no room for those who are exclusivist, and there's plenty of room in this world for those who are inclusivist. And if we open our heart to include everybody, I think we will accomplish the mission that we were created for, that Craig is working for, many of us are working for, including you, Khalil. And I know this is a part of your mission in life.